The candle went out before she finished reading. That was the detail Elara Thornfield would carry with her for the rest of her life. Not the cold of the room, not the scratching of the pen against paper, not even the sound of Mordecai Voss's voice moving through the darkness like smoke through a keyhole. Just the candle. The way it guttered once, twice, and then surrendered entirely to the dark, leaving nothing but the faint orange memory of a flame on the back of her eyelids. "Just there at the bottom," Voss said. His voice was patient, the way deep water is patient, unhurried, certain of its own depth. "It is only paperwork, all administrative necessity before your journey." She had not read the bottom. She could not read anything at all. The room was a cave, but her hand had already found the pen, and the pen had already found the paper, and somewhere in the darkness her name had been written down in a place she could not see. The scratch of the signature, the soft exhale of Voss behind her, and then, very quietly, almost tenderly, the strike of a new match. The fresh candle he lit was smaller than the first. Its circle of light barely reached the edge of the desk. He folded the papers before she could turn back toward them, and he smiled at her with the practiced warmth of a man who had learned long ago that warmth was a tool like any other. "There," he said, "that is done." She did not know then what she had signed. She knew now that she had not known. She knew now that the not knowing had been the point. Her name was Elara, and she had been watching people since she was 16 years old. Not watching the way idle people watch, not with the detached amusement of someone cataloging the follies of others. Watching the way a person watches when they have learned that survival depends on reading the room correctly. Watching for the small tells that arrive before the words do. The way a shoulder tightens before a lie. The way a voice drops half a register when someone wants something they are not willing to ask for directly. The way a person's hands move when they are performing ease rather than feeling it. Her parents had died in a fire when she was 16. She had not been home that evening. She had been 3 houses down watching the neighbor's youngest while the neighbor's youngest refused to sleep. And she had looked out the window and seen the orange light on the horizon, and had known immediately, with a certainty that bypassed all the ordinary machinery of disbelief, what that light meant. She did not speak of that night. She did not speak of what it meant to walk back toward a house that was no longer a house, toward a life that had in the space of an evening become a different kind of life entirely. She did not speak of the weeks that followed, the legal proceedings, the appointed guardian, the particular quality of helplessness that comes from being 16 years old and female, and without a single adult in the world who answers to the name of family. Mordecai Voss had been appointed by the court. He was a man of 55 who wore his respectability like a pressed suit, smooth and fitted and carefully maintained. He had an office and a housekeeper and a reputation among the men of Philadelphia who moved paper from one side of a desk to the other and called it commerce. He had never, in the 2 years Elara lived under his roof, raised his voice at her. He had never touched her. He had never, in any way that could be documented or witnessed, been cruel. What he had done was quieter than cruelty. He had simply removed, piece by piece, every circumstance in which Elara might encounter a person who would ask whether she was all right. He had engineered, with the patience of a man playing a very long game, a kind of isolation that wore the face of protection. She did not see friends. She did not attend church without him. She did not receive letters that he did not first see. There had been one letter she was never meant to find. A friend of her mother's had written from Boston, asking after Elara, asking whether she was well, asking whether the house on Chestnut Street had been settled properly. Elara had found the envelope in the waste bin beside his desk, torn open, the letter missing. She had held the empty envelope in her hands and read her mother's friend's handwriting on the front, and understood something about Mordecai Voss that she had not understood before. That the isolation was not negligence, it was architecture. She had kept one thing he could not take from her. In a small wooden box that had been her mother's, she kept a document she did not fully understand. A land certificate bearing her father's signature and a parcel number and an address she had never visited. Bitterroot River, Montana Territory. And on the back, in her mother's handwriting, faded now, barely legible, a sentence that Elara had read so many times she could have written it in her sleep. Do not let anyone take this from you. Whatever they say, however frightened you are. She had kept the box. She had kept the words. And when Voss had placed the mail-order bride contract in front of her 3 months ago and explained that this was the path forward, that a suitable arrangement had been found, that she would be well provided for, she had gone very still inside herself and asked one question. Where? Montana Territory, he had said. A rancher. Perfectly respectable. And she had looked at him and thought about the wooden box and thought about her mother's handwriting and said nothing at all. The train from Philadelphia to Mill Haven took 4 days, and Elara spent those days the way she had learned to spend any extended period of enforced stillness, watching, storing, making sense of what she observed. The landscape changed as they moved west and north. The dense eastern cities gave way to farmland, and the farmland gave way to something broader and less managed, land that had not been fully persuaded to cooperate with human intentions. By the 3rd day, the sky was enormous, and the horizon was far away, and there were mountains in the distance that she had never seen anything like, standing there with the permanence of things that were not going anywhere and had never been asked to. She had a compartment companion for 2 of those days, a woman named Dorothy Callan, who had the settled self-possession of someone who has been through enough to be no longer interested in the opinion of people who have not. She was in her early 50s, plainly dressed, and she talked the way some people of her generation talked, with a generosity of detail that assumed the listener was interested in the whole story rather than just the conclusion. She had lived in Mill Haven for 3 years, she said. Her husband had worked for a mining company called Ridgecrest before his death the previous year. The territory was changing, she said, with the expansion of the railroad and the mining operations moving up the river valleys. Land that had been considered remote was becoming valuable. There had been disputes. She mentioned the Bitterroot River Valley in passing, the way someone mentions a place they know well when it comes up naturally in conversation. She mentioned the name Thornfield. She said it in connection with a parcel of land and the Ridgecrest Mining Company and a transaction that had been in the local news. The kind of transaction where someone who should benefit from it did not, for reasons that were legal on paper and troubling in practice. She said it with the mild disapproval of a woman who has opinions about how things ought to be done and is not shy about expressing them. She did not know she was speaking to the Thornfield in question. She had no reason to. Elara listened and kept her expression neutral and stored the information in the careful interior filing system she had been building for 2 years. The place where she kept things she did not yet understand but recognized as important. When the train stopped at a junction station on the 3rd day, she looked out the window and saw a man on the platform sending a telegram. He stood with his back to her, but she recognized the particular set of his shoulders, the way he held himself with the careful arrangement of a man who has decided how he appears to others. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand after speaking to the telegraph operator. It was a gesture she had watched 1,000 times across a dinner table. Mordecai Voss, in Montana, ahead of her. She sat with that for a long time. The train pulled away from the station. The telegraph office grew small and then smaller, and then disappeared entirely behind a curve of hillside, and Mordecai Voss with it, and the gesture she had watched 1,000 times across a dinner table, and the particular quality of dread that came from understanding that the man who had controlled every circumstance of her life for 2 years was not behind her. He was ahead. He was already where she was going. Outside the window, the mountains grew larger and the sky grew wider, and she turned the information over in her mind the way you turn a stone to see what is underneath it. He had not come to ensure her arrival. She understood that with a certainty she did not try to argue herself out of. He had come for something else. The question was what? And the question connected in her mind to the name Thornfield on the Bitterroot River and $15,000 and a land certificate in a wooden box that her mother had written on the back of in handwriting that had faded with age but not with uncertainty. 3 weeks after the night of the candle, Elara stepped off a train in Mill Haven, Montana, into air so clean and cold and enormous that it nearly knocked her sideways. Philadelphia smelled like cold smoke and wet stone, and the particular exhaustion of too many people living too close together. Montana smelled like nothing she had a word for, like distance made physical, like space itself had a scent, and it was this: pine and snow melt and the raw mineral breath of mountains that had been standing since before anyone thought to name them. The cold was not the closed, damp cold of eastern winters. It was open. It moved. It had the quality of something alive, something that came off the peaks and traveled the valleys and touched everything it passed without apology. She stood on the platform with a travel bag at her feet and a small wooden box pressed against her ribs, and she looked at the landscape opening out before her as though the world had simply forgotten to stop. And then she saw the 3 men waiting at the edge of the platform, and the world stopped on its own. She had been told one name: C. Mercer, rancher, 34 years old. That was the entirety of the information Voss had offered her, delivered with the brevity of a man describing livestock. One man, one name, one line on a contract she had not read fully either. There were 3 of them. They stood in a row with the patience of men accustomed to waiting, accustomed to weather, accustomed to silence. The oldest was in front. He was the kind of tall that makes other tall men feel ordinary. Broad through the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with the particular machinery of his bones. His hair was dark chestnut, touched at the temples by the kind of sun that does not ask permission. His eyes, when they found her across the platform, were amber, and they did not look away. He did not smile. He did not raise his hand. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at a mountain pass before deciding whether it can be crossed. The second man stood slightly behind and to the right of the first, his weight resting easy against a post. His hair carried a warmth to it, some reddish current running under the brown when the afternoon light hit it directly. His eyes were darker, a whiskey color, and they were not looking at Elara at all. They were watching her reaction to the first man, cataloging something. measuring something with the quiet methodology of a person who understands that the most useful information is rarely the obvious kind. The third was youngest. He stood at the far edge of the group with his hat held in both hands rather than on his head, turning it slowly by the brim. When Elara's gaze reached him, he met it directly, and there was in his expression neither the assessment of the oldest nor the calculation of the middle. There was simply curiosity. Unguarded, unashamed, genuine curiosity, as though she were something he had been wondering about for a long time and was only now permitted to see. He was the only one who had removed his hat. Elara's grip on the wooden box tightened. She had prepared herself for strangeness. She had not prepared herself for this. For 3 versions of the same essential presence, standing before her in ascending order of openness, each one a different answer to a question she had not yet figured out how to ask. She had expected a transaction, a handshake and a wagon ride, and the quiet mechanics of 2 strangers learning to share a roof. She had not expected to feel, standing on a train platform in Montana with the wind pulling at her hair and the cold finding the gaps in her coat, that she was being seen. Not appraised, not inventoried, seen. And that the seeing was being done by 3 separate pairs of eyes, each one reading a different page of the same story. She walked toward them. She kept her back straight the way she had taught herself to keep it straight, the way that was not about dignity so much as about not giving anyone the satisfaction of watching her bend. The oldest one reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her without preamble. "The terms of the arrangement," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. It had the same quality as the landscape, she thought. Wide. Not unkind, but not warm. Simply there the way mountains are there. Elara took the paper. She unfolded it. She read it. Not quickly, not with her eyes skimming the surface the way eyes do when they are frightened or in a hurry, but slowly, line by line, the way her father had taught her to read any document worth reading. She read to the final paragraph, and there, in language that was careful and legal and precisely chosen, was a clause that said the wife agreed to relinquish all independent inheritance rights for the duration of the marriage. She read it twice. She folded the paper along its original creases and held it in her fingers and looked at the oldest man. "The final clause," she said, "regarding inheritance rights. Does this apply to property I bring with me to the arrangement?" No one spoke for a moment. The second man made a small sound, barely audible, that might have been a cleared throat. The youngest glanced sideways at the oldest, then looked quickly back at Elara. The oldest man looked at her for a long moment. "We will discuss that." "We will discuss it now," Elara said. The youngest man turned his face slightly away. The second man looked at the sky. The oldest man looked at Elara Thornfield, 18 years old, dusty from 3 days of train travel, holding a folded piece of paper in one hand and a wooden box against her ribs with the other. And for the first time since she had stepped onto the platform, something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but something adjacent to respect. "Now," he agreed. She learned their names during the brief conversation that followed. The oldest was Callan. The middle was Stellan. The youngest was Bridger. 3 Mercer brothers, occupants of a 30,000-acre ranch in the Montana Territory, running it between themselves for 14 years since their father died. Stellan was the one who broke the silence at dinner, and he broke it with the most practical question available to him. "Can you cook?" "Not well," Elara said. Stellan considered this. Neither can we. That simplifies the expectations considerably. Bridger pressed his lips together in the particular way of someone suppressing a reaction they have decided is not appropriate to the situation. Callan did not smile, but the corner of his mouth moved. It moved in a direction that was not quite a smile, but was not entirely not a smile either. And Elara cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, filed it in the place where she kept things that were small but might later prove important. Callan placed a second document on the table after the plates were cleared. This was a set of household terms, detailed, covering work and provision and the particular legal geography of her role at Mercer Ridge. She read it in full. She reached the clause that referenced inheritance rights again, the same language as the first document, and she looked up. This clause, she said, it appears in both documents. It is standard, Callan said. Whose standard? He did not answer immediately. The lamp between them threw its light in both directions. Bridger was washing the dishes at the basin and had gone very still. Stellan was looking at the table. I will need to understand what property you intend this to cover, Elara said, before I sign anything further. Callan looked at her across the table. What property did you bring with you? She held his gaze. I brought a wooden box. In the box is a land certificate bearing my name. I want to know whether this clause is intended to affect that certificate. The kitchen was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly longer than ordinary moments last. Bridger set down the dish he was holding, carefully. The way you set something down when you are buying yourself a second to think. Stellan looked at Callan. Callan looked at Elara. We will need to see the certificate, he said finally. When you tell me what this clause is for, she said, I will consider showing it to you. It was the first time in 2 years that she had said no to a request for information from a man sitting across a table from her. She had not planned to say it. It arrived in her mouth fully formed the way things do when they have been waiting longer than you knew. Callan studied her. His amber eyes were measuring, but it was a different kind of measuring than she had felt from Voss. Voss measured what she was worth to him. This man was measuring something else. She could not name it yet. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she agreed. The journey from the Mill Haven station to Mercer Ridge had taken the better part of a day, and the landscape they rode through was not like anything she had seen or read about or imagined. It was too large for imagination. The mountains stood at the horizon in a way that suggested they had always been there, and would always be there, and were entirely indifferent to the small movements of people and horses across their foothills. And when Mercer Ridge came into view along a creek-cut valley, she found herself sitting straighter in the saddle without quite deciding to. It was not what she had expected. What she saw was a house that someone had taken care with, log and stone, solid and fitted, with a covered porch and a kitchen garden on the east side. The barn was larger than the house. Everything had been built by hand. She understood this without being told. These men had not purchased what they lived in. They had constructed it piece by piece against the specific arguments of this specific land. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she opened the wooden box, and she looked at her father's signature and her mother's words, and she thought for a long time. Then she turned the certificate over and read the address once more. Bitterroot River, Montana Territory. She had read it 100 times before. She read it again, and this time she was reading it in a room at Mercer Ridge, and the name of this place was not yet on the document, but it was in the same landscape, the same territory, the same country of mountains and snowmelt and fence lines that ran straight and true. On the kitchen shelf that evening, she had noticed 3 tin cups with initials scratched into the metal. CSB. The scratching was uneven, done years ago, done by younger hands. No one had replaced the cups. The shelf beside the window held 12 books. She counted them automatically, a habit, and noted that 4 of them were not about farming or law or livestock. One was a collection of American poetry. One was a natural history of the Western Territories. One was a novel she had read herself once in what felt like another life. There was a chair in the corner of the main room that no one sat in. It was an older chair, better quality than the others, and there was a thin sifting of dust on the armrest that had not been there from neglect but from a specific, deliberate choice not to disturb. Elara looked at the chair and understood something about these 3 men that none of them had told her. Something about loss carried quietly. Something about a space kept empty because filling it would mean admitting it was gone. She closed the wooden box. She held it in her lap. She sat with the mountains outside the window and the silence of a house that held 3 men's grief in its walls. And she thought about what her mother might have known when she wrote those words on the back of a land certificate and hid the warning inside a keepsake. Her mother had known. Somehow, at some point, her mother had understood that this piece of land was not simply property, that it was the kind of thing people move against, the kind of thing that turns people who smile at you into people who arrange for candles to go out at convenient moments. She put the box on the bedside table. She lay down. She did not sleep for a long time. She thought about her father. The specific quality of his attention when he was working through a problem, the way he would go very quiet and then emerge. Something that was not a conclusion exactly, but a direction. She had inherited that quality. She had spent 2 years learning not to show it. She would need to show it now. Outside, the Montana sky held more stars than she had ever seen in her life, and the mountains stood against them like the edges of something vast and indifferent and permanent, and somewhere in the darkness between this room and the Bitterroot River, there was a piece of land with her father's name on it and her name after his, and the question of why she was here and who had arranged it and what they expected to gain was already assembling itself in her mind with the slow, certain patience of a thing that would not be ignored. She fell asleep, holding the box. In the morning, everything would begin. The second day brought cold, clear light and the particular silence of high country mornings. A silence so complete it seemed to have mass, something you move through rather than simply occupied. Elara was at the kitchen table before any of the brothers, a habit from the Philadelphia years when the first person awake in a house was the safest person in it. She sat in the chair closest to the stove and listened to the house settle around her, the logs ticking as they released the cold of the night, the faint creak of the roof adjusting itself against the wind, the distant, muted sound of horses shifting their weight in the barn. She studied the kitchen in the early gray light with the attention she brought to every unfamiliar room. The stores were organized but not inventoried. Flour in a tin marked with nothing. Salt in a jar that had once held something else. Coffee in a sack tied with twine that had been retied so many times the original knot was buried under layers of newer ones. There was food enough for 4, but it was the food of men who ate to work rather than men who had learned to think about what they were eating. She could work with this. Organization in a kitchen is worth more than talent when there are 4 people to feed before the light is fully up. Callan came in second. He stopped when he saw her. Not with surprise exactly, but with a slight recalibration, The way a man adjusts when the room he expected to be empty is not. Then he moved to the stove and began building the fire in the same efficient sequence she had watched him use the evening before. He did not speak. She did not speak. The fire built itself between them, and the room grew from cold to bearable. When the coffee was ready, he poured 2 cups and set one on her side of the table. He sat across from her with his own cup. He did not add anything to it. He drank it the way he did everything, without ceremony, without waste. She wrapped her hands around the cup and felt the heat move through her fingers and into her palms, and she thought that this was the first morning in 2 years that she had sat across a table from a man and not felt the need to calculate what he wanted from her before he said it. That thought surprised her. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that might be fragile, and she did not examine it too closely. Not yet. The days that followed had a rhythm to them. Not the rigid, engineered rhythm of the Philadelphia house, where every hour served a purpose that Voss had determined. This rhythm was older and less interested in human preferences. It was the rhythm of land and weather and animals that needed tending, regardless of what the people tending them might prefer to be doing instead. Elara learned the stores. She learned the schedule. She learned that Callan drank his coffee without anything added and drank it early. That Stellan ate more than he appeared to need and never mentioned it. That Bridger took his time over breakfast in a way the older 2 did not, lingering at the table after the others had gone out, as though the warmth of the kitchen was something he was unwilling to surrender to the cold morning before he absolutely had to. These were small things, all. But small things were what she had, and small things accumulated carefully had a way of becoming something larger than they appeared. She reorganized the pantry on the 3rd morning. No one asked her to. She simply opened the stores and began, and no one stopped her. She labeled the tins. She separated the dry goods from the preserves. She found a sack of cornmeal that had gone weevily and set it aside and found a second sack behind it that was still good. She made a list of what was there and what was missing and what would be needed before the month was out. When Stellan came in from the south fence line that afternoon and saw the pantry, he stood in front of it for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, without looking at her, "We have never had a list." "You do now," Elara said. He looked at the list. He looked at the pantry. He looked at the list again. Then he walked out without comment, and she understood that this was his version of approval. Stellan did not perform his reactions. He simply had them, privately, and moved on. She cooked that evening. It was not good cooking. The cornbread was dense, and the beans were under-seasoned, and the salt pork was cut unevenly, because she had not yet learned the particular stubbornness of the knife that hung beside the stove. But it was organized cooking. Everything arrived at the table at the same time and at the correct temperature and on plates that had been wiped clean, and this, in a house where meals had for 14 years been assembled rather than prepared, was noticed. No one said anything about it. But Bridger ate everything on his plate and then looked at the empty plate with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering his expectations. And Stellan, who ate more than he appeared to need and never mentioned it, took a second helping of the cornbread without being offered one, which Elara understood was, from Stellan, something close to a standing ovation. Bridger was the one who found her in the barn on the 4th morning. She had gone to look at the horses. There were 11 of them, working animals mostly, with the particular stocky build of horses that have spent their lives at altitude. But 2 of them were something finer. A bay mare and a gray gelding, that moved with a precision suggesting they had been chosen for qualities beyond utility. "The bay is Callan's," Bridger said from behind her left shoulder. He had a gift for arriving without sound that should have startled her, but did not. He bred her himself. 3 years. "The gray is mine." "What is hers called?" "Callan does not name horses." She looked at the bay mare, who was looking back at her with dark, intelligent eyes. "That seems like a waste." "I have said so," Bridger said. "He disagrees." There was a pause. She heard him move to stand beside her rather than behind her. A foot of distance between them, both of them looking at the horses. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Badly," she said. "I managed the journey here without falling off, which I consider a personal victory. That is a low bar. I set it deliberately." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She kept looking at the horses. After a moment, he said in a different tone, "I could teach you if you want. There is time in the mornings before the main work." She considered the offer. She considered the ease with which it was given, without obligation attached, without the subtext of debt that she had learned to hear beneath every offer made by people who wanted something in return. This offer had none of that. It was simply an offer. "All right," she said. He nodded once. They went into breakfast. The riding lessons began the next morning. Bridger was methodical about it in a way that had nothing of the impatience she had expected. He started her on the gentlest animal in the barn, a gelding with a calm disposition and a forgiving mouth. He did not give her instructions so much as demonstrations, showing by doing, letting her watch, and then try. And when she got something wrong, he found a way to correct it that did not feel like correction. On the third lesson, she asked him why he had started teaching her before she had been there a week. He thought about it for a longer moment than the question seemed to require. "Because you looked at the horses the way someone looks at something they want to know better," he said finally. "Not like something to be afraid of, like something to understand." She looked at the horse she was riding and thought that was one of the more perceptive things anyone had said to her in recent memory. It was on the 5th afternoon that she noticed the bay mare favoring her left foreleg. The swelling was slight, easy to miss if you were not looking for it, easy to dismiss if you were. Elara was looking for it. She had spent 2 years with nothing to read but the books Voss permitted, and among those books, by accident or oversight, had been her mother's herbal compendium, a worn volume with notes in the margins in her mother's hand. She had read it cover to cover 4 times. She had memorized the poultices and the preparations and the applications, not because she intended to use them, but because they were her mother's words and her mother's knowledge, and holding them in her mind was a way of holding her mother close. She went to the meadow behind the kitchen garden. She found comfrey growing along the creek bank where the soil was damp and rich. She found yarrow on the south-facing slope. She crushed the leaves between her palms the way the book described, working them until the fibers broke and the smell rose up, green and sharp and medicinal. The smell of her mother's kitchen on the afternoons when her mother had been making preparations for the neighbor's sick horse or the church deacon's swollen knee. She made a poultice and wrapped it in a strip of clean cloth, and she went to the barn, and she knelt beside the bay mare's foreleg, and she applied it with steady hands and a low voice, and the particular attention of someone who understands that healing an animal is mostly about convincing the animal to allow itself to be healed. The mare stood still for her, not because she was calm by nature. She was Callan's horse, which meant she was particular and suspicious and not inclined to tolerate strangers. She stood still because Elara's hands were steady and her voice was low, and she did not rush. She gave the mare time to smell the poultice, time to decide, time to accept what was being offered rather than having it forced upon her. It was a principle Elara understood in her bones, the principle of being allowed to choose. She did not know that Callan was watching from the barn door. She did not know until later, until Bridger mentioned it in passing, that Callan had stood there for several minutes without speaking, watching her hands on his horse, watching the mare stand still for her, watching something he had not expected to see in a woman who had arrived from Philadelphia with a travel bag and a wooden box and the particular bearing of someone who had learned to survive by making herself small. He did not mention it to her. He did not need to. The mare's leg improved over the following days, and one morning Elara found a second herbal volume on the kitchen table. It had no note attached. It was a veterinary manual, worn and dog-eared, and it had been placed beside her coffee cup before she came down. She opened it. She read the inscription on the inside cover. It said, in handwriting she recognized as younger and less guarded than Callan's current hand, property of E. Mercer, their father. She held the book for a moment. Then she set it beside her mother's herbal compendium on the shelf in her room and understood that something had shifted in the house that had not been discussed and would not be discussed and did not need to be. The morning of the 7th day, Callan came to the kitchen before dawn with a map she had not seen before, a survey map of the surrounding territory. He unrolled it on the table. He smoothed its edges with the flats of his hands, the way a man smooths something he has looked at many times. He turned it so it faced her. She looked at it. She found the Bitterroot River. She found the parcel she recognized from the certificate. She found the name printed at the eastern boundary of that parcel, Mercer Ridge. She did not let anything show on her face, but her hand, resting on the table, found the lip of the wooden box that she had carried with her to breakfast out of a habit she could not explain, and her fingers closed around it. The map was detailed. She could see the contour lines of the river valley, the hatched markings indicating elevation changes, the small precise notations in a surveyor's hand marking distances and bearings. She could see where the Bitterroot parcel sat in relation to the surrounding territory. It was not remote. It was not insignificant. It was positioned at the junction of river and ridge in a way that anyone with knowledge of land and water would recognize immediately as valuable. Her father had known. He had chosen this specific parcel for specific reasons, and those reasons were visible on the map to anyone who understood what they were looking at. Elara understood what she was looking at. She had spent 2 years with nothing to do but read and think and observe, and in that time she had developed the habit of seeing patterns in the arrangement of things. The pattern here was clear. The parcel was valuable. The parcel was hers. And someone had gone to considerable trouble to ensure she did not know either of those facts. You already knew, she said. It was not a question. Callan wrapped both hands around his cup. I knew there was a land dispute on the eastern border. I knew the parcel was held in a Thornfield name. I did not know the Thornfield was you until I saw the certificate last night. He paused. The wind came off the mountain outside and moved through the valley like a long breath. And the contract, she said. The mail order bride contract. That was arranged through an agent in Philadelphia, he said. I did not choose the agent. My brothers and I chose to try the arrangement. We did not choose the particulars. Another pause. Shorter. I am beginning to understand that the particulars were chosen for us. Elara looked at the map. She thought about Dorothy Kellam on the train, the woman who had mentioned the Bitterroot in passing, who had said the name Thornfield in the same breath as Ridgecrest Mining and $15,000 and a deal that would go through if the heir never showed up to claim what was hers. She set the wooden box on the map. She opened it. She placed the certificate face up between them. Callan looked at it for a long time without touching it. "The clause in the contract," she said. "The inheritance clause. Did your lawyer draft that, or did the agent provide the language?" The look on Callan's face answered the question before he did. "The agent provided the document in full," he said. "Then we have a problem," Elara said. "But I think you already knew that too." He looked at her across the map and the certificate and the coffee gone cold between them. And for the second time since she had arrived, she saw something in his expression shift. Not toward softness. Toward something more useful than softness. Toward honesty. "Yes," he said. "We do." That evening, Stellan returned from Mill Haven without all the supplies he had gone for and with a particular set to his jaw that Elara had already learned in 6 days meant that something had arrived from an unexpected direction. He waited until all 3 brothers and Elara were in the same room. Then he said without preface that a man from Philadelphia had been asking after the Thornfield girl at every saloon and supply store in Mill Haven. The man's name, according to the bartender at the Elkhorn who had an opinion about everyone who walked through his door, was Drummond. Elara felt the name before she processed it. Felt it the way you feel a change in temperature before you understand what caused it. The name was not Voss. It was Drummond. But the description Stellan gave matched Voss precisely. The pressed suit, the practiced manner, the way he held his hands when he spoke, fingers laced, thumbs touching. A gesture of contained authority that she had watched across 100 meals in the Philadelphia house. He was using a different name. That meant something. That meant he did not want the name Voss attached to whatever he was doing in Mill Haven, which meant that whatever he was doing in Mill Haven was something he expected to need distance from later. The name landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Callan set down the cup he was holding slowly, with a precision that had nothing accidental about it. Bridger had gone very still by the window. He was holding the frame with both hands, not in agitation, but in the way of someone who needs to hold something solid while they absorb information that rearranges what they thought they knew. Stellan was watching Callan. Callan was looking at Elara. She met his eyes, and she did not look away. She had spent 2 years learning not to flinch from a man's gaze, and the skill, like most skills acquired through difficulty, had not left her. "You know that name," Callan said. "He was my guardian," she said, "for 2 years after my parents died, until I turned 18. He was appointed by the court, and now he is in Mill Haven. Yes, he followed you here. He came ahead of me," she said. "I saw him at a station along the route sending a telegram. I did not know what it meant at the time." The room held its breath. It was Bridger who spoke, and what he said was not a question. "He did not come to bring you back." "No," Elara said. "He came to make sure I do not find out what I have. And if I find out, to make sure I cannot use it." Stellan also brought something else from town. Not supplies. Information. The woman who ran the boarding house on the main street had been talking about the Mercer brothers and the girl from Philadelphia. The talk had the specific quality of small-town conversation that is less about curiosity and more about judgment. 3 unmarried men and a young woman from the East. The boarding house woman had opinions. She was sharing them freely. And freely shared opinions in a town the size of Mill Haven had a way of becoming the accepted version of events before the people those events concerned had any say in the matter. The bartender at the Elkhorn had heard it too, and the woman at the general store, and the clerk at the land registry office, who had mentioned it to Stellan when Stellan came in for supplies, mentioned it the way people mention things when they want you to know that they know and want to see how you respond. Stellan had not responded. That was his way, but he had filed it, and he brought it back to the kitchen table with the same efficiency he brought everything else. Elara listened to this without expression. She had survived worse than gossip, but she understood what it meant. It meant that the ground she stood on was not only legally uncertain, it was socially fragile. And socially fragile, in a territory where a woman's reputation determined whether she could walk into a store or a courthouse and be taken seriously, was a weapon that Mordecai Voss would know exactly how to use. That night, after the brothers had gone to their rooms, Callan spread the map on the kitchen table again and sat down. But he did not sit across from Elara. He sat beside her. She noticed this. She did not remark on it. He laid it out without ceremony. The 200-acre parcel along the Bitterroot River was not simply land. It had a small copper deposit in its northeastern corner. Nothing substantial by the standards of the larger mining operations moving through the territory, but enough to be worth the attention of a company called Ridgecrest Mining that had been acquiring parcels along the river valley for the past 18 months. $15,000 was the offer currently on the table. It was a significant sum. It was also, Callan said, roughly a quarter of what the full parcel would be worth in 5 years if the mining survey currently underway confirmed what the preliminary assessment suggested. There was a spring on the southern edge of the parcel. Good water. The kind of water that becomes the most valuable thing in a dry summer. More valuable than copper. More valuable than anything you can extract and sell. The kind of water that keeps a ranch alive when everything else is uncertain. The eastern boundary of the parcel ran directly along the edge of Mercer Ridge. Elara sat with all of this for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me about the guardianship clause." Callan looked at her. "What do you know about it?" "I know there is one. I know it has a deadline. I do not know the specific terms because I was not shown them when I should have been." "Tell me." He told her. The clause in the guardianship agreement that Voss had filed with the Philadelphia court when he was appointed allowed him to act as trustee for Elara's property interests until she either turned 19 or married with court approval. She had turned 18. She had not yet turned 19. The marriage contract signed in Philadelphia had not been certified by a Montana territorial judge, which meant that legally, in the jurisdiction where the land sat, she was still an unmarried minor ward under Mordecai Voss's guardianship. She had 40 days. 40 days from tonight before the trustee clause expired, and control of the property passed through a holding mechanism that Voss had constructed over the past 2 years, piece by piece, document by document, in the small, patient way of a man who understood that large thefts are best accomplished through the accumulation of small, legitimate-looking steps. She sat with the number. 40 days. It was not a long time. It was not a short time. It was a specific time, and specificity, she had learned, was the enemy of the kind of vague, overwhelming helplessness that Voss had cultivated in her for 2 years. When a threat is vague, it fills every room. When it has a number attached to it, it becomes something that can be managed. 40 days was a deadline. A deadline was a boundary. and a boundary was something you could stand on. When Callan finished speaking, the kitchen was very quiet. Elara looked at the map. She looked at the parcel that bore her family's name. She looked at the spring on the southern edge and thought about water in a dry summer, and thought about her mother's handwriting on the back of a document that had been kept safe in a wooden box for 2 years because her mother had known somehow that it would need to be kept safe. Then she stood up. "No one will marry me to solve a legal problem," she said. "That is not a solution. That is a different version of the same problem." Stellan looked at Callan. Callan looked at Elara. "The land is mine," she said. "I will find a way to stand for it myself." The territorial court in Mill Haven does not recognize an unmarried female ward as a competent party in property disputes without male representation, Callan said. His voice was not unkind. It was simply the voice of a man stating a fact he would prefer were not a fact. "Then the territorial court in Mill Haven is wrong," Elara said. "Yes," Callan said. "It is. That does not change what it will do." And they looked at each other across the table with the map and the documents and the lamp between them. And Elara thought about the chair in the corner that no one sat in, and the tin cups with the scratched initials and the books on the shelf that included a volume of poetry a rancher had no obvious reason to own. And she thought about what it means to build something with your own hands on land that does not forgive mistakes. And she thought that this man understood loss in the way that you only understand it when it has come for something you built yourself. "Tell me about the land dispute," she said. "The 400 acres on the northern boundary. Stellan mentioned it." Callan was quiet for a moment. Stellan looked at the table. Bridger looked at Callan. 8 years ago," Callan said finally, "a man named Garrett filed a competing survey claim on our northern pasture. We had documentation. We had witnesses. We had a lawyer who we paid well and who argued clearly." He paused. "The lawyer on the other side had a relationship with the presiding judge that our lawyer did not have. The ruling went against us." Another pause. Shorter. "I learned several things from that. The first was that law and justice are not the same thing. The second was that the man who stands in front of the court carries more weight than the man who stands behind the lawyer." He said these things without bitterness. That was what struck her. There was no self-pity in the telling, no performed outrage, just the plain, clear recounting of a lesson learned through loss, delivered with the economy of a man who has had 8 years to distill the experience down to its essential elements and discard everything that does not serve. Elara looked at him. "And the third? That I should have stood up myself and spoken what I knew to be true, regardless of what the procedure required. I waited for the process to work. The process was broken before I arrived." She held that for a moment. "I will stand up myself," she said, "when the time comes. Whatever the procedure requires." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way he nodded when something was decided, not with enthusiasm, but with finality. "Then we have work to do," he said, "and 40 days to do it." The lamp between them burned low. Outside the kitchen window, the mountains were just beginning to disappear into the darkness, their edges dissolving against a sky that held the last thin line of twilight along the western ridge. Somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped once and was still. The wind found the gaps in the log walls and moved through them with the low, persistent voice of something that has been moving through these valleys since before anyone built walls to keep it out. Callan stood. He paused at the foot of the stairs. He did not turn around. "For what it is worth," he said, "I would not have shown you the map if I intended to take what is yours." Then he went up. His boots on the stairs were slow and measured, and then they were quiet, and then there was nothing but the wind and the lamp, and the map still spread on the table like a territory waiting to be claimed. Elara sat at the table after he had gone. She sat in the quiet kitchen with the map still spread before her, and the wooden box beside it, and the coffee, long cold, and the night pressing against the windows. She thought about 40 days. She thought about a man in Mill Haven who had spent 2 years building a cage around her life, and was now building a different kind of cage around her inheritance. She thought about a territorial court that did not recognize her standing, and a community that was already forming opinions about her presence, and a piece of land beside a river that her father had chosen and her mother had protected, and that she had carried in a wooden box for 2 years without fully understanding what she was carrying. And she thought about 3 men who had built everything they had with their own hands and lost their father to a fall from a roof and kept his chair empty for 14 years, and who had, without any of them quite deciding to, begun to make room in their lives for a woman who arrived with a bag and a box and a question about inheritance clauses. She did not yet know what that room would look like. She did not yet know whether it would hold. She knew only that it existed, and that its existence was not something any of them had planned, and that the things you do not plan for are sometimes the things that matter most. She closed the box. She held it against her ribs. She went to bed. 40 days. The count had begun. The storm came on the 9th night without much warning. Montana weather, Stellan had told her in his dry way, does not send letters ahead of its arrival. It simply appears, fully formed, already committed. She woke to the sound of wind finding every gap in the log walls at once, a sound like the house breathing hard, and then to Callan's voice in the hallway, low and sharp, saying something in a tone that meant the situation had already moved past the point of casual response. She was up and dressed before she had fully decided to be. She took the lamp from the bedside table and went to the kitchen and found the door to the outside already open, and the cold coming in waves, and the darkness outside lit by the occasional white flicker of lightning still distant over the mountains. The air smelled different than it had when she went to bed. It smelled of ozone and wet earth, and the raw mineral scent of stone that has been struck by water after a long dry spell. The wind was not the steady wind she had learned over 9 days. It was erratic. It came from one direction, and then another, and then from everywhere at once, as though it could not decide what it wanted to destroy, and was trying all the options simultaneously. Stellan and Bridger were already in the barn when she arrived. She could hear the horses before she reached the door. The hollow thud of hooves against stall boards. The high, tight sound that horses make when they are genuinely frightened rather than merely nervous. It was a sound she had not heard before, and it moved through her chest the way certain sounds do, bypassing the thinking part of the mind and arriving directly at the part that understands danger. The lantern inside threw jumping shadows across the rafters. She went in. The roof had lost a section of boards on the east side. Rain and wind were coming through in a diagonal sheet that caught the lantern light and turned it into something broken and scattered. 2 of the horses in the nearest stalls had worked themselves into a state that was moving toward dangerous, and Stellan was at one and Bridger at the other, both of them talking low and steady in the way of men who have done this before and know that the voice matters more than the words. She took the lamp to the hook on the center post. She found the coiled lead lines on the near wall. She went to the stall of the 3rd horse, a big roan that was rolling his eyes and moving in tight circles, and she opened the gate and went in with him. She did not know what she was doing precisely. She knew the principle of it, that you keep your movements slow and your voice low, and your body between the horse and the thing that frightens him, and that you hold the line without pulling, because pulling tells him there is something to pull against. She knew the principle the way you know things from books and from watching. She had never applied it in a barn in the dark during a storm with a horse that outweighed her by 800 pounds. She applied it anyway. She spoke to the roan the way she spoke to the bay mare when she changed her poultice each morning. Low, steady, without urgency, without the false brightness that people use when they are trying to convince an animal that everything is fine when everything is clearly not fine. She spoke to him the way she would want to be spoken to if she were the one trapped in a small space with the sky coming apart above her. She kept her breathing even because the horse could feel her breathing through the line and through the air between them. And if her breathing was afraid, his breathing would stay afraid. She stood her ground when he circled close, and she did not flinch when his shoulder brushed hers, and she held the line with both hands and waited. He slowed, not all at once. The circles widened. The eyes stopped rolling. The breathing changed from the short, sharp breaths of panic to something longer and deeper. He was still frightened, but he was no longer alone in it, and that made it something he could carry. Callan came in 10 minutes later, his coat dark with rain. He stopped just inside the door and looked at the 3 stalls, and then at Elara, who was standing in the roan's stall with both hands on the lead line and her feet planted and the horse still moving, but no longer moving in the frantic, tight circles of a few minutes before. He did not say anything. He crossed to her stall and took position at the gate. Not inside with her, not replacing her, simply there, at the edge of her space, in case she needed another point of contact for the line. She did not need it, but she understood the gesture. They held the horses through the worst of it, the 4 of them, while the wind worked at the roof and the rain came diagonal through the gap and the lightning moved closer and then further and then closer again. When the peak of it passed and the horses settled into something that was merely unsettled rather than dangerous, no one moved immediately. They stood in the barn in the lamplight with the rain still coming through the broken section of roof and the particular physical and emotional heaviness that arrives after a crisis has moved through and left you intact. Bridger was the one who started talking. He talked about a storm he had been through when he was 19, a storm that had taken every animal they owned in a single night. He talked about it the way he talked about everything, without drama, with a precision of detail that meant he had been carrying the memory in close contact for a long time. The lost animals, the morning after, the silence of the pastures. When he stopped, the barn was quiet except for the rain. "My parents died in a fire," Elara said. "I was not at home. I was 3 houses away, and I looked out the window and I saw the light and I knew." No one spoke. "I used to think about what would have happened if I had been home," she continued. "It took me a long time to understand that the answer to that question is that I would not be here. So the question does not help anything." She paused. The rain was easing now. The wind had shifted direction and was no longer driving through the broken roof section. The roan beside her had dropped his head and was breathing the long, slow breaths of an animal that has decided to trust the person holding his line. "I still ask it sometimes," she said, "but I know it does not help." Callan was standing at the gate of the roan's stall. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not assessment, not calculation. Something older than either of those things. Something that had no clean name. "Our father fell from the roof," he said, "patching shingles before winter. I was 20. I found him the following morning." He said it the same way she had said her thing, plainly, without reaching for effect. Stellan was 16. Bridger was 12. Then he said something else. Something she could see had been sitting inside him for a long time, pressing against the walls he had built around it, waiting for a moment when the walls were thin enough to let it through. "I was the one who told him to go up," he said. "I said I would do it the next day. But the weather was turning and he said he would handle it himself. I said fine. I went to the barn. I heard nothing. His hands were resting on the top rail of the gate. She watched them. They were not still. There was a tremor in them, fine and continuous. The kind of tremor that comes not from cold, but from the effort of holding something steady that wants to shake apart. "I found him at dawn," he said, "at the base of the north wall. The shingles were still on the roof where he had been working. He had not finished. The barn was very quiet. The rain had nearly stopped. Somewhere outside, water was running off the roof in a stream that would find the creek, and the creek would find the river, and the river would carry it away. And in the morning, there would be no evidence of the storm except the broken section of roof and the mud in the yard, and the particular quality of light that arrives after a sky has emptied itself completely." Stellan was looking at the floor. Bridger was looking at his hands. Neither of them had heard Callan say this before. Elara could see it in the quality of their stillness. This was not a familiar telling. This was a first telling, or close to it, spoken in a barn in the dark after a storm, to a woman who had been there for 9 days and who had just held a frightened horse steady through the worst of it with nothing but a lead line and a low voice and the willingness to stand in a place that was dangerous without pretending it was not. Elara did not speak. She reached across the gate rail and placed her hand on his forearm, lightly, briefly. Then she withdrew it. It was not a gesture of comfort so much as a gesture of acknowledgement. A way of saying, "I heard you," without diminishing what had been said by trying to fix it or explain it or place it in a context that would make it easier to carry. Some things are not meant to be easier to carry. They are meant to be carried. And the carrying is the thing. Callan looked at her hand where it had rested on his arm. He looked at the place on the gate rail where it had been. Then he looked at the roan standing quiet beside her, and at the barn around them, and at the broken roof where the rain was still coming through, but gently now, gently, as though the storm had spent itself and was apologizing with its last few drops. He did not thank her. He did not say anything about what he had just told her. He simply looked at her with an expression that had changed from what it had been 10 minutes ago, and what it had changed into was something that did not have a word in the language of men who build things with their hands and keep their grief in the walls of their houses and do not speak of it. But it was there, and she saw it, and he knew she saw it, and that was enough. The silence that followed was not the silence of the first dinner. It had changed its character entirely. It had become the kind of silence that exists between people who have been through something together and do not need to fill the space with words to confirm that they were both there. They went in from the barn an hour later. Stellan made coffee. Bridger found the bread from breakfast. They sat around the kitchen table with wet hair and dirty hands and drank coffee that was too strong and ate bread that was 2 days old and no one said anything meaningful for a long time. But the silence was warm. It had weight and substance, and it held them the way a room holds the people inside it when the room has been built well and the walls are sound and the fire is lit. In the morning, without discussion, Callan put the map on the table and sat down beside Elara to look at it. Beside her, not across from her. She noted this. She did not remark on it, but she understood that something had changed in the night. Something in the architecture of this household had shifted, and the shift was visible in the smallest of details. In the direction a man chose to sit. They spent 2 hours going through the documents that Stellan had gathered from the Mill Haven Land Registry office on his trips into town. Survey maps, filing records. A chain of correspondence between a Philadelphia address and the Ridgecrest Mining Company that Stellan had found in the Public Telegraph Archive because Montana territorial law required commercial telegrams to be registered if they involved property transactions. In that correspondence, in language that was careful and elliptical and designed to be understood only by the people it was intended for, was a sequence of instructions regarding a Thornfield heir and a guardianship window, and the importance of ensuring that the heir did not make contact with legal counsel before the trustee mechanism could be finalized. The trust mechanism itself was a document of considerable legal sophistication. It had been written by people who understood property law in multiple jurisdictions and had taken care to create a chain of transfers that would be, once completed, extraordinarily difficult to challenge. Each step was legitimate on its own terms. The problem, the kind that required standing back far enough to see the whole shape of it rather than any individual piece, was that the aggregate purpose was fraud. Elara read it twice. She set it down. "He planned this before I was 18, she said. "Before you were 17, based on the filing dates," Stellan said from across the table. She thought about 17-year-old Elara in the Philadelphia house, learning which silences were safe and which were not, learning to disappear when she needed to, learning the particular art of being present without being noticed. She had thought she was surviving. She had been right. But the thing she was surviving had been larger and more deliberate than she knew. "The mail-order bride contract," she said. "He chose your family specifically." Callan looked at her. His expression had the quality of a man watching pieces he had been holding separately suddenly connect into a single picture. A picture he had suspected but had not wanted to confirm until the evidence required him to. "The parcel shares a boundary with your property," she said. "If I am here, married into the Mercer name by a contract he controlled, and the marriage clause voids my independent inheritance rights before I understand what I have, then the land transfers cleanly. Ridgecrest gets the parcel. He gets his commission. And no one has done anything illegal in any way that can be proven in a territorial court." She paused. "It is elegant. In a terrible way." Callan was quiet for a moment. "We were part of it without knowing." "Yes. Does that change anything for you?" She considered the question seriously. He waited for her to consider it without filling the space. She was beginning to understand that this was one of his particular qualities, the ability to ask a real question and then actually wait for the real answer. "It changes the context," she said finally. "It does not change what I think of you." He looked at her for a long moment. "What do you think of us?" "I think you built everything you have with your own hands," she said. "I think you have been honest with me since the moment I asked you to be. And I think that took something, because you did not have to be." She paused. "I think your youngest brother takes his hat off when a woman approaches because someone taught him to, and he never forgot it, even when there was no one around to notice." Another pause. Longer. I think the chair in the corner was your father's. The kitchen was very still. Yes, Callan said. I think you are three men who have been a family so long that you have forgotten you made rules for yourselves that most people never have to make, because most people have more than three. She looked at the map, then back at him. And I think I am sitting here because someone decided I was a piece in someone else's game. But I am not. And I would like the opportunity to prove that. Callan held her gaze for a long moment. Then he turned the map slightly, orienting it better for them both to read, and said, "Then let us talk about the spring." That afternoon, while Stellan was at the south fence and Callan was in the far pasture, Elara found herself alone in the kitchen with Bridger and the particular quality of an ordinary afternoon that had not been arranged by anyone. He was mending a piece of harness at the table. She was making the weekly inventory of the stores that had become her habit because having accurate information about what was available felt, in the specific way that certain practical habits feel, like a form of security. She said, without planning to, "Your brother, when he went to the land registry, did he already know what he was looking for, or did he know to look and not yet know what he would find?" Bridger set the harness down. He thought about it with the genuine consideration he brought to questions that deserved it. "Stellan works from edges inward," he said. He found the edges first. The what came after the where. She nodded. She wrote something in her inventory and then looked up. He does not show much. No. But he came back from Millhaven the third day without the supplies he went for. Yes. He went for information instead. Yes. She looked at the harness on the table and thought about three men who had been building something for 14 years, who had learned between them all the roles that a larger family distributes among more people. Callan decided. Stellan gathered. Bridger held. She thought about what it meant to hold that many functions in three people and what it did to a person over time and what might be possible in a life where there was room for someone whose roles had not yet been assigned. Bridger picked up the harness and returned to his work. She returned to her inventory. The afternoon light moved across the kitchen floor and the stove made small settling sounds, and outside the wind came and went along the mountain. And it was, she thought, a very ordinary afternoon. She was finding that she valued ordinary afternoons more than she once had. In Philadelphia, ordinary meant unguarded, and unguarded meant vulnerable. Here, ordinary meant something different. It meant that no one was performing. No one was arranging. The afternoon simply was what it was, and the people in it were simply who they were, and that was enough. She had not known that enough could feel like this, like warmth, like rest, like the particular relief of setting down something heavy that you have been carrying so long you forgot it had weight. That evening, she told Stellan about Dorothy Kellum, the woman from the train. The woman whose husband had worked for Ridgecrest Mining and who had mentioned the Thornfield name in passing and who had, Elara was now certain, kept records that her husband had left behind. Records that would matter. She laid it out the way Callan laid things out, without decoration, without apology. The facts arranged in the order that made them clearest. Dorothy Kellum's husband worked for Ridgecrest Mining for 7 years. He died last year. He told his wife before he died that certain business records he had kept at home concerned a transaction he was troubled by. Dorothy mentioned the Thornfield name on the train without knowing she was sitting across from the Thornfield in question. She mentioned it in connection with a deal that would go through if the heir never showed up. People who mention names they should not know usually have reasons, Elara said. I want you to find the reason. Stellan looked at her. It was the first time she had given him a direction rather than responded to one. She watched him register this. She watched the slight adjustment in his posture, the recalibration that happened when a person you have been thinking of as a variable in someone else's equation suddenly reveals that she has been building an equation of her own. She lives in Mill Haven, Elara said. I do not know the street. I will find her, he said. He rode for Mill Haven that same evening and did not return until well after midnight. He said nothing about what he had found when he came in. He set his coat by the door and went to bed. Elara, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea she had been pretending to drink for an hour, understood that silence meant he had found what he went looking for. She sat for a while longer after the house had gone quiet. She opened the wooden box. She took out the certificate. She turned it over in the lamplight and read her mother's words again. Do not let anyone take this from you. Whatever they say, however frightened you are. She thought about her mother writing those words. She thought about when and why and what her mother had known or suspected that had made those words necessary. She thought about the fact that her mother had hidden the message on the back of a legal document, in a place where only someone who turned the paper over and read past the obvious would find it. She put the certificate back in the box. She closed the lid. She held the box in her lap for a while. Then she got up and took it to the kitchen table and sat in the dark and waited for morning, because morning was coming and there was work to do. I have spent 2 years being a person things happen to, she said to the empty kitchen, to the mountains outside the window, to the darkness and the silence and the house settling around her. I will not spend another day being that person. She stood up. She went to the window. Outside, the mountains were just beginning to separate themselves from the sky, their edges finding definition against the first gray light of a Montana dawn. The kind of light that does not ask your permission before arriving, that comes regardless of whether you are ready, that illuminates everything with complete indifference to your preferences. She watched it come. She was still watching when she heard Callan's boots on the stairs and the sound of the fire being rebuilt in the stove and the quiet morning beginning itself again around her. Neither of them spoke, but he poured her coffee first before he poured his own, and he set it on the table in front of her, and she wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at the mountains coming clear in the distance, and thought that some things do not need to be said to be understood. 5 horses would ride for Mill Haven before the week was out. 5 horses in the gray light of a morning that had not yet decided what kind of day it intended to be. And Elara Thornfield would carry a wooden box under her arm and one word ready in her mouth, and the steady, clear knowledge that she was done, waiting for the world to decide what to do with her. She was going to decide for herself. The wooden box sat on the table beside the cold tea. The certificate inside it bore her father's signature and her mother's warning, and the address of a place she had never seen, but was beginning to understand was the reason for everything that had happened to her since she was 16 years old. 31 days remained. The storm had passed. The morning was coming, and Elara Thornfield was ready for it. Mordecai Voss arrived on the 14th day. He came with 2 riders from town and a lawyer named Pemberton, who had the slightly pressed look of a man who has been engaged for a purpose he has been told not to look at too directly. He came in the late morning when the light was clean and honest and offered no shadows to stand in, which was, Elara thought, a tactical error on his part. Voss operated best in half light. She saw them coming from the kitchen window. She had been making bread, her hands in flour, and she wiped them on the cloth beside the basin and stood at the window for a long moment watching the three riders approach along the creek road. She did not feel what she expected to feel. She had been bracing for fear, for the particular cold compression in her chest that had been Voss's primary effect on her for 2 years. She felt something else instead, a clarity, cold and precise. The feeling of a thing that has been approaching for a long time finally arriving and resolving the waiting into something that could be dealt with directly. She went to the door of the barn where Callan was working and said simply, "He is here." Callan looked up. He set down what he was holding. He came out of the barn and stood in the yard as the riders came through the gate, and Stellan came from the south fence line, and Bridger appeared from the direction of the upper pasture. All three brothers converging on the yard with the unhurried purposefulness of men who have spent their lives reading what a situation requires before it announces itself. Voss dismounted. He was exactly as she remembered him, pressed and arranged. He looked at Elara, then he looked at the three brothers arrayed behind her, and she watched him make the rapid recalculation she had watched him make many times. The instant inventory of the room, the assessment of where the leverage was. "Elara," he said. His voice was warm. It had always been warm. "I am relieved to find you well." "Mr. Voss," she said. He looked at Callan. "I am Mordecai Voss. I am this young woman's legal guardian, and I have ridden from Mill Haven to ensure that her rights and well-being are being properly attended to." He used his real name now. In Mill Haven, asking after her at the saloons, he had called himself Drummond. That he used his own name here meant he had decided that directness would serve him better than distance. It meant he was confident. Elara noted this the way she noted everything. Confident men make different mistakes than cautious ones. "She is attended to," Callan said. Voss smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that appeared genuine to people who had not spent 2 years studying its construction. "I am glad to hear it. I do have some paperwork I would like her to look over. A simple matter of clarifying her inheritance arrangements before the guardianship window closes. For her protection. You understand." "She will not be signing anything today," Callan said. "She will not sign anything without adequate time to read it fully, in good light, with her own counsel present." Something moved behind Voss's eyes. Not anger. Adjustment. She watched him find his next angle. "The marriage contract," he said pleasantly, "is not certified by a Montana territorial judge. Legally, your claim to act as this young woman's advocate is not yet established. She remains under my guardianship until that certification occurs." He produced a document from his coat. "I have here a court order from the Mill Haven bench requesting her attendance before the judge within 72 hours to confirm her voluntary presence." Elara stepped forward, past Callan, past the front of the group. She stood where she chose to stand, which was ahead of everyone. "I will appear before the judge," she said, voluntarily. "I will confirm my presence here and my circumstances." She held his gaze. "I will also bring documentation that I believe the judge will find relevant to the question of whether the guardianship arrangement has been administered in good faith." The lawyer Pemberton looked at the ground. The two riders from town exchanged a glance. Voss held his smile in place with the effort of a man holding a door shut against something large. "That sounds entirely sensible," he said. He remounted. He rode out. At the gate, he paused and looked back at Elara. And for just a moment, The smile dropped. What was underneath it was not rage. It was something colder than rage. The expression of a man doing a rapid inventory of his remaining options and finding that several of them had been removed while he was not looking. Then he rode on. The yard was quiet again. Bridger was the one who came to stand beside her after the others had dispersed. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You are not afraid of him." "I was," she said, "for 2 years." "What changed?" "I stopped being alone with the information," she said. "Fear works best in isolation. When you are the only person who knows what you know, you start to doubt whether you know it at all. When someone else knows it too, it becomes real." Bridger was quiet beside her, and she could feel him thinking. The particular quality of his silence that was different from Callan's silence. Callan's silence was a wall. Bridger's was a room you could stand in. "He will not stop," Bridger said. "No," she agreed. "He will not." She looked at the mountains. She looked at the yard where the hoof prints of Voss's horse were still fresh in the mud, but then neither will I. That night, she went to her room after dinner and reached for the wooden box on the bedside table. She opened it the way she always opened it, with both hands, lifting the lid slowly because the hinge was old and she did not want to stress it. She reached inside for the certificate. It was there, but it was wrong. The fold was reversed. She always folded the certificate with the text facing inward and her mother's handwriting facing outward, so that when she opened it, the first thing she saw was her mother's words. The certificate was now folded with the text facing outward. Someone had taken it out, opened it, and put it back. And they had not known which way it went. She sat on the edge of the bed and held the certificate in her hands and felt the cold move through her. Someone had been in her room. Someone had touched the box. Someone had read the certificate and put it back and thought she would not notice, and they had been wrong about that because Elara Thornfield noticed everything. It was the only skill that 2 years with Mordecai Voss had given her that she was grateful for. One of the riders had not been there for escort. He had been there for access. While she and the brothers stood in the yard having a conversation with Voss, the house had been empty. In the morning, the confirmation came from town. Voss had filed a copy of the certificate with the Mill Haven Court, accompanied by a motion arguing that the document had been improperly removed from guardianship records and that its disposition fell under the authority of the court-appointed trustee. Not Elara. Him. Stellan brought the news back from his morning ride to the supply store. He delivered it without expression, the way he delivered all information, as material to be processed rather than reacted to. Elara stood at the kitchen table and felt the ground she had been building under herself for 14 days shift beneath her feet. She had planned to present the certificate as evidence the court had never seen, as proof that she knew what she owned and understood what was being taken from her. The element of surprise had been her advantage. It was gone now. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the table. She breathed. Callan was watching her from across the kitchen. Stellan was standing by the door. Bridger was at the window. The room was very still and very full of the kind of silence that happens when people are waiting for someone to decide what comes next, and the someone is not the person they expected it to be. "It does not change what the certificate says," Elara said. "It does not change whose name is on it. It does not change what my mother wrote on the back. It changes the presentation. It does not change the truth." She looked up. "We ride tomorrow as planned." That night she did not open the box. She did not read her mother's words. She lay on the narrow bed in the room that smelled of cedar and cold, and she stared at the ceiling, and she let the weight of 2 years press down on her the way she had never allowed it to press down before. She had held it at distance. She had managed it. She had organized it the way she organized pantries, into categories that could be addressed one at a time. She could not organize it tonight. Tonight it came all at once, the fire and the empty house and the smell of smoke that she could still smell if she closed her eyes. The 2 years of silence, the 2 years of letters that never arrived, the 2 years of sitting across a table from a man who smiled at her while he dismantled her life with the patience of someone pulling threads from a garment one at a time so the wearer does not notice until it falls apart. She cried. She had not cried in 2 years. She had decided at some point during the first month at Voss's house that crying was a luxury she could not afford because crying required feeling the full weight of what had happened, and feeling the full weight would have made it impossible to get up in the morning and survive another day of being managed. She cried now, not loudly. The tears came without sound the way they do when a person has been holding them for so long that they have forgotten how to make noise on the way out. She lay on the bed and let them come, and did not try to stop them, and did not try to make them mean something. She just let them be what they were. In the morning, there was a cup of coffee on the kitchen table when she came down, already poured, already placed on her side. Callan was at the stove. He did not look at her in the way that people look at you when they know you have been crying. He looked at her the way he looked at her every morning, directly, without flinching. He did not mention it. He would never mention it. And she understood that this was not indifference. It was the particular kindness of a man who understands that some things are sacred precisely because they are not discussed. They rode for Mill Haven before dawn. 5 horses in the gray light moving through a landscape turning toward spring. The grass finding its color. The river high with snowmelt. Elara rode between Bridger and Stellan. Callan rode ahead with Sheriff Gideon Hale, who had met them at the Ridge Road. Hale was 62 and had been sheriff for 11 years, and had grown tired of watching the legal apparatus be used as a tool for purposes the law had not intended. He had said this one thing quietly over coffee, and then said nothing further. It was enough. Half a day from Mill Haven, the road narrowed through a cut between 2 rock faces. In that cut, blocking the road with their horses placed sideways across the track, were 2 men. They had the look of men hired for a purpose, rather than men who had arrived at one. Callan stopped. Hale's hand moved to his coat. It was Bridger who moved forward. He walked his horse past Callan and stopped 20 feet from the 2 men. "You will want to move," he said. His voice was conversational, almost gentle. "Not because we cannot go around, and not because you are frightening anyone, but because the sheriff of Mill Haven County is sitting behind me, and he is looking at your faces, and he has a very good memory." One of the men glanced at the other. Hale moved his horse forward 1 step. The 2 men moved aside. The group rode through. As they came down toward Mill Haven, Elara pulled her horse alongside Bridger. "Thank you," she said. "They were not going to stop us." "I know. Thank you anyway." He looked at her, and something in his expression had the quality of something said without words, something that had been accumulating for 14 days. He did not say it. Neither did she, but it was there between them. Clear as the morning, Mill Haven was waiting. The judge was waiting. Voss was already there. She was certain, already arranging his papers, already composing his pleasant, reasonable, carefully constructed version of events. She straightened in the saddle. She had one word ready. She had been carrying it since the night in the kitchen with the lamp and the map and the truth finally laid out in full. The night she had stopped being a person things happened to. One word, clear, in good light, before a judge who read carefully and a sheriff who had decided where he stood. She rode down toward Mill Haven with the spring sun on her shoulders and the wooden box tucked under her arm, and her mother's words running like water beneath everything she was about to do. Mill Haven in the early morning had the quality of a place that had not yet decided what kind of day it intended to be. The main street ran straight between two rows of board-fronted buildings, and at the far end, set back on a slightly raised foundation, the territorial courthouse, log construction, two windows facing the street, a flagpole from which the territorial flag moved in the morning wind with the slow authority of something that knows it will outlast everyone watching it. Elara looked at the building and felt the particular stillness of a thing completed. She had been moving toward this room for 2 years. The courthouse door was open. Inside, through the window, she could see lamplight already burning. Voss had taken the front bench on the left side of the room. He sat with his coat buttoned and his hat on his knee, and Pemberton arranged beside him. And when the 5 of them came through the door, he turned and looked at Elara with an expression of such practiced concern that she almost admired its construction. Almost. The room was filling. The benches were occupied by townspeople who had found reasons to be at the courthouse on this particular morning. The bartender from the Elkhorn, the woman from the boarding house. Sheriff Hale took his position beside the door. Judge Harlan Birch came in from the back room at 8 o'clock precisely. He was 60 years old with white hair and a face that carried the particular leather of high-altitude sun. He sat down. He arranged his papers. He looked at the room over his reading spectacles with the expression of a man who has heard every possible kind of story and has developed efficient methods for determining which ones are true. He looked at Voss. He looked at Elara. He looked at the 3 Mercer brothers, each in turn. Then he said, "Let us begin." Voss went first. His lawyer had structured the presentation well, building from the most sympathetic version of each fact outward. The guardianship was real. The court appointment was real. The legal mechanism was genuinely what he said it was. He placed the trust documents on the table. The mail-order bride contract. The property filing records. And then he placed the document Elara had signed in the dark. He placed it last with the quiet deliberateness of a man setting down a card he expects to end the hand. "My ward signed this document freely," Voss said, "in my presence." She was of sound mind and legal age, and she understood the nature of what she was signing. Judge Birch looked at the document for a long time. He did not touch it. He looked at it the way he looked at everything, with the attention of someone who reads not just what a document says, but what it is arranged to make you think it says. "Freely," he said. "Entirely," Voss said. Birch looked at Elara. "Miss Thornfield, you have heard the documents presented. I have one question before we go further." He paused. "Did you sign this document freely?" The room was very quiet. Elara had been sitting through Voss's presentation with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her face composed in the particular expression she had developed over 2 years of sitting across from this man while he made arrangements and called them care. She had listened to every word. She had noted every choice of language. She had filed every detail in the place where she kept things that were small but would later matter. She stood up. No one had asked her to stand up. The procedure did not require it. She stood up because she had decided at Mercer Ridge on the 7th night that she was done with the posture of someone waiting to be addressed. No. One word. Clear. No qualification. No hedging. No apology attached to the front of it. The room shifted. It was a physical thing. The shift. The way a room changes its weight when something true has been said simply. "Explain," said Judge Birch. "The candle went out," she said. "Before I finished reading the document, Mr. Voss lit a replacement. The replacement was smaller and positioned further from the pages I was meant to sign. I could not read the text in that light. He knew I could not read it. He waited while I signed, and he did not offer to move the candle closer or to wait while it was replaced." She paused. "I have signed my name to things in that house for 2 years. Most of them were what he said they were. This one was not. I know the difference because I have had 2 years to learn the difference between things Mr. Voss presents openly and things he presents at angles." Pemberton rose from his bench. "Your Honor, the young woman is characterizing her guardian's intentions without evidence of those intentions. The signature is the operative fact." "Sit down, Mr. Pemberton," Judge Birch said without looking at him. He was looking at Elara. "Go on." "I would like to offer into evidence a land certificate bearing my name and my father's signature," she said, designating a parcel along the Bitterroot River in this territory. "I would also like to offer documentary evidence regarding the current disposition of that parcel and the terms under which Mr. Voss has been acting on my behalf." She placed the wooden box on the table. She opened it. She placed the certificate before the judge. She placed beside it the correspondence from the Telegraph Archive that described the operational plan for ensuring the heir did not make contact with legal counsel. She stepped back. Judge Birch read both documents. He read them in the full, complete way that he read everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then Stellan rose from the second bench and said, "Your Honor, I have a witness I would like to bring forward." A door at the back of the room opened. Dorothy Callan came in. She walked to the chair before Judge Birch with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has already decided what she came to say and sees no reason to delay saying it. She placed on the table a document in a worn paper envelope. "My husband worked for Ridgecrest Mining for 7 years," she said. "He kept copies of certain business records at home. He told me before he died that these records concerned a transaction he was troubled by and that I should keep them in case they were ever needed." She looked at the envelope on the table. He was right that they were troubled. And it appears he was right that they would be needed. The document was the internal contract between Mordecai Voss and Ridgecrest Mining. Not the sanitized external version. The internal version. The one that said plainly what the external documents had said carefully. $3,000 payable upon confirmation that the Thornfield heir had not filed a competing ownership claim before the 1st of June, 1878. Pemberton sat very still. The 2 riders Voss had brought were looking at the floor. Voss looked at the document on the table. He looked at it with the expression of a man watching something he has constructed over years come apart in a sequence that is happening faster than he can manage. He stood up. His voice was still controlled, still warm. "What this young woman is describing is a misunderstanding," he said. "She has been influenced by 3 men who have a direct financial interest in her property." He looked at Elara. He used the voice he had used with her for 2 years, the voice that knew where she was most uncertain. "You think these men want you?" he said. And in the courtroom, his voice was quiet enough that it was almost private, almost just the 2 of them. "You think they helped you because of who you are, but look at the map. Look at where that land sits. Look at what they gain. He let that land. I am the only person in this room who has no interest in your property. I am the only one here for you. Elara looked at him. She looked at him fully, the way she had never been able to look at him for 2 years. Not sideways. Not from the corner of her vision while appearing to look at something else. Directly. The way you look at something when you are no longer afraid of what you will see. She saw him clearly. She saw the pressed suit and the practiced expression and the warmth that was a tool. She saw someone who had looked at a wooden box that belonged to a 16-year-old girl and seen not a keepsake, but an asset. She saw someone who had spent 2 years engineering isolation and calling it protection, who had arranged a candle and darkness and a pen and called it paperwork. She saw someone very small. She had been afraid of him. She had given him, without choosing to, the enormous power that fear gives the person you fear. And now, standing in a courtroom in Mill Haven, Montana, with spring light coming through 2 windows, and a judge who read things carefully, and a sheriff who had decided where he stood, she felt that power go out of him like water out of a broken vessel. Not because anything had been resolved yet, simply because she could see him clearly. And what was, there was not large enough to justify 2 years of that particular cold feeling in her chest. She turned away from him. She turned toward Judge Birch. "I have one more thing," she said. "On the back of the land certificate, my mother's handwriting. I would like the judge to read it." Birch turned the certificate over. He read it. His expression did not change, but something in it settled. The settling of something that has found its final weight. He placed the certificate down. He looked at Voss. "Mr. Voss, you signed a commercial agreement contingent on your ward's failure to claim her property, a ward for whose well-being you were legally responsible. I want you to explain to me how those 2 things are consistent with each other." Voss opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. What came out was not explanation. It was the sound of a careful construction giving way under its own accumulated weight. He said things about the complexity of estate management and the unreliability of a young woman who had been manipulated. He said them with declining composure, the warmth dropping away in layers, the practiced quality falling apart into something underneath that was neither warm nor practiced, just defensive, and increasingly loud. Judge Birch let him speak until he had exhausted the available arguments. Then he said, "Thank you, Mr. Voss. Sit down." He looked at his papers. He looked at the certificate. He looked at Elara. "Miss Thornfield, do you wish to claim ownership of the parcel designated in this certificate?" She did not look at Voss. She did not look at the 3 brothers on the bench behind her, though she felt their presence the way you feel something solid when you have been standing on uncertain ground. She looked at Judge Birch. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. He picked up his pen. The formal proceedings took another 2 hours. Documents were reviewed. Language was argued. Pemberton became increasingly careful and then increasingly quiet. Hale gave a statement that was 3 sentences long. Dorothy Callan answered 3 questions with the directness of a woman who has nothing left to protect except the truth. At 11:45, Judge Harlan Birch declared the release of inheritance document void on grounds of invalid signing conditions under the Territorial Contract Statute of 1872. He placed the guardianship trust mechanism under review, pending a full accounting of all transactions conducted under its authority. He confirmed the Thornfield certificate as a valid ownership claim for the Bitterroot parcel. He noted for the record that the matter of Mordecai Voss's conduct as a court-appointed guardian would be referred to the Philadelphia Circuit for further inquiry. Voss was not placed under arrest that morning. The investigation would take time and the law moved at the pace of the law. But when he rose from the bench and walked toward the door, he walked differently than he had walked in. Something had gone out of him that was not coming back, and everyone in the room could feel its absence. At the door, he stopped. He did not turn around. He stood in the doorway with the light coming in around him and said to no one in particular, and to Elara in particular, "You have no idea what you have stepped into." Elara from across the room said, "I know exactly what I have stepped into. I have the certificate." The room was quiet for a moment. Then, from somewhere on the right side of the benches, someone made a sound that was almost certainly a laugh that had been converted at the last moment into a cough. Voss walked out. She watched him go from the courthouse porch. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction. She felt the quiet, settled weight of a thing completed. The way you feel when you set down a tool at the end of a day's work and look at what you have built and find it sound. She stood on the porch of the courthouse with the wooden box under her arm and the spring sun on her face. Behind her, she could hear the room emptying, the shuffle of feet on boards, the low conversation of townspeople. Hale's voice giving an instruction to someone. She could hear, without turning around, 3 pairs of boots. Stellan came to stand on her left. Bridger came to stand on her right. Callan came last and stood slightly behind, not because he was uncertain of his place, but because he understood that this moment belonged to her and that the correct position for the people who had helped was not in front of it. Stellan said, "Dorothy Kellum. I found her the evening before. She had been waiting for someone to ask. How did you know to look? You mentioned on the train that she used the Thornfield name. I thought there was probably a reason. So I went looking for it." She nodded. "Thank you. I was looking for evidence," he said. Finding her was incidental. She knew that was not entirely true. She also knew it was how he would always characterize it, and she was beginning to find his particular brand of understatement a comfort. The comfort of a thing you can count on after years of counting on nothing. The bartender from the Elkhorn came out and stopped on the porch. He looked at Elara and extended his hand. She took it. "Miss Thornfield," he said, "you should know the whole town had already chosen a side before you walked into that room." He nodded once and walked off. The woman from the boarding house was standing across the road. She met Elara's eye and dipped her chin. The same woman who had been spreading opinions 2 weeks ago. The same woman who had seen something in a courtroom that changed the shape of her opinion entirely. Callan was at the fence rail where their horses were tied. He was looking at the mountain range visible at the end of the main street. The peaks still carrying their winter white against a sky that had turned the deep, clean blue of a high country afternoon. She walked to the fence and stood beside him. He did not speak immediately. She had come to understand that his silences were not empty. They were full of things he was deciding how to say, and the decision took him longer than most because he was constitutionally unable to say it incorrectly. He would wait as long as it took to say it right. She waited. "You spoke well in there," he said finally. "I said what was true. That is not always easy in front of a room full of people. No, it is not." The wind moved through the street, carrying the smell of the river and the pine from the hills above the town. One of the horses shifted its weight and blew softly through its nose. "I want to ask you something," Callan said. He was still looking at the mountains. Ask. When you looked at the certificate, when you first found the address on it and understood where the land was, what did you think about us? About whether we had known? About whether we were part of it? She considered the question. It deserved consideration. It was the kind of question that had a fast answer and a true answer, and they were not always the same. I thought that the easiest explanation was that you had known and used it, she said. That would have been the expected thing. The thing that fit the pattern of how I had been treated for 2 years. She looked at the mountains, too. But you had turned the map toward me before you had any reason to. And you had asked me about the inheritance clause in clear language the first day rather than letting it pass. And you had told me things about the northern boundary dispute without being asked. She paused. People who are using you do not give you information you could use against them. He was quiet. I thought you might have been part of it without knowing, she said. That seemed more likely. And then I thought that if you were, and you found out, you would want to fix it. That was a feeling rather than a conclusion. But it turned out to be right. He turned from the mountains and looked at her. It was the same amber gaze she had met on the platform at Millhaven Station 3 weeks ago, but it did not have the same quality. Then it had been measuring distance and determining whether a crossing was possible. Now it was something else. The particular look of a man who has been alone in a specific way for a very long time and has found, without particularly planning to, that he is no longer alone in that way. Elara Thornfield stood on her own land for the first time on the 3rd of May, 1878, on a morning when the Bitterroot River was running high and cold with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods along the bank were just beginning to find their leaves. The parcel was 200 acres of river bottom and hillside. The spring on the southern edge ran from a seam in the limestone outcrop above the meadow, clear and cold and continuous, the kind of water that does not stop in dry years because it comes from deep in the rock rather than from surface snowpack. She stood at the edge of the spring and looked at the water coming out of the rock, and she thought about her father choosing this place. He had been a practical man, the kind who made decisions based on specific qualities rather than general impressions. He had chosen a spring. He had chosen a river bottom. He had chosen elevation enough to avoid the worst floods and proximity enough to water to survive the worst droughts. He had chosen a piece of land that was good for living on, not just good for selling. He had put her name on it. She opened the wooden box. She took out the certificate. She held it in both hands in the spring morning and looked at her father's signature and the particular quality of ink that has aged on paper and become the color of something permanent. Behind her, she heard the sound of 3 horses on the approach trail. She heard them stop at the edge of the meadow. She heard the quiet that followed, the particular quality of people deciding whether to come forward or to wait. She did not turn around. She looked at the water coming from the rock. "Come down," she called. The grass was wet with morning, and the horses moved through it with their heads low, tasting the spring growth. Stellan dismounted first and stood at a polite distance, which was his way. He looked at the land with the attention of a man who understands land and does not need to say so. Bridger dismounted and came to stand a few feet to her left, close enough that she could feel his presence without needing to look. He was holding his hat in both hands the way he had held it on the platform at Millhaven Station, and she thought there was something right about that, some completeness in the returning of a gesture to the place where it had begun. Callan came last. He walked his horse down the slope and stopped at the edge of the spring and looked at the water for a long moment. Then he looked at her. She looked at him. The morning was very clear. The river was loud with snowmelt. Somewhere above the limestone outcrop, a hawk was working the thermals, cutting slow arcs against the blue. "It is good land," Callan said. "Yes, it is. Your father knew what he was choosing." "He did." She looked at the box in her hands. "My mother knew too. She wrote on the back before I was old enough to understand it. She knew someone would come for it, and she wanted me to be ready." She paused. "I was not ready, but I got there." Callan looked at the spring. He looked at the hillside above it. He looked at the river and the cottonwoods and the long run of the valley toward the mountains. "The eastern boundary of this parcel runs along the fence line we rebuilt in the fall," he said. "The spring feeds into the same watershed as the northern pasture on the ridge." He said it the way he said things that were facts, plainly, without reaching for what they implied. He left the implication for her to find. She found it. "Neighbors," she said, quietly. The word arriving with less weight than she had expected, as though it had been waiting a long time to be the right word, and had finally found its moment. "Or something beyond that," Callan said. "If you chose it." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains, the way he looked at mountains when he was saying things that mattered. Because it was easier to say difficult, true things when you had something large and permanent to look at. "No one will choose it for me," she said. "No," he said, "they will not. I am telling you, it is available to be chosen. The choosing is yours." Stellan had found a reason to examine the limestone outcrop on the far side of the meadow. Bridger was looking at the river with the concentrated attention of someone who has decided not to hear the conversation happening 15 feet away. Both of them making exactly the space the moment required without being asked. "We should plan what to do with this land," she said, "properly. With paper and measurements and someone who knows the water table." "I know the water table," Stellan said from the outcrop. "Then we will need paper," she said. Bridger smiled. It was a complete smile, the kind that uses the whole face, and it changed his expression entirely from what it was to what it had been waiting to become. Callan looked at her in the way she had come to know as his version of the same thing, the slight movement at the corner of his mouth, the settling of his expression into something that was not quite soft, but was the shape of soft. The way stone looks when the light hits it in the evening, and you understand that it has warmth in it that it does not usually show. We show of the hawk above the limestone turned one more arc and then banked away toward the mountains. The spring ran out of the rock in its clear, cold continuity. The river moved through the cottonwoods at the edge of the meadow, doing what rivers do, which is move forward without looking back, carrying everything that has been upstream down toward whatever comes next. Elara Thornfield stood on her land in the spring morning and looked at what was hers and at what had been built by the people standing around her and at the long valley running toward the mountains. And she thought that her father had been a practical man who made decisions based on specific qualities rather than general impressions. She was his daughter. She began to make a list. A house on the south slope, near the spring, where the morning light would come through east windows. A fence line that connected to the one Callan had rebuilt in the fall. A root cellar dug into the hillside where the limestone kept things cool. And somewhere in the kitchen at Mercer Ridge, a fourth tin cup on the shelf beside the other three, with a letter scratched into the metal that had not been there before. Later, Callan would say that he knew something had changed on that morning at the spring, not because of anything she said or did, but because of the way she looked at the land. Not like someone who had been given something, like someone who had come home to something that had been waiting. There is a difference. Most people never learn it. Elara Thornfield learned it on the 3rd of May, 1878, standing at the edge of a spring that ran out of limestone and did not stop. The fear only keeps its power when no one challenges it. And sometimes the only thing you need is one word said clearly in good light to the right person. One word is enough. It always was.